Perfect.
Yeah, no edited.
Yeah, for sure. Yes. Sure. Okay, perfect.
Okay.
Well, Martha, thank you very much for joining me.
You're welcome.
Martha Crenshaw. So, as I indicated to you a little bit earlier, I wanted to speak to you a bit about your career, some of the work you've done, and get a sense of how you see your work fitting within the broader domain of conflict studies. Conflict studies understood as involving the analysis of a variety of different forms of political violence, both the onset of political violence, the diffusion of political violence, and even the ending and prevention of political violence. And of course, you've done really crucial work, particularly in terrorism. So I thought one way we could start off is simply having you speak a little about what research of yours you're the most proud of, and how you see your work and what you really think is particularly impactful.
Mm-hmm. Well, of course, my work has almost all been on terrorism. And I think that in the first place, I'm simply pleased that I developed an interest in the study of terrorism and developed an interest very early, because I've been working on terrorism really since the late 60s, early 1970s. So well before it became a hot topic and a big policy issue, I was already trying to understand the phenomenon. So I feel like I had a pioneering role in the study of terrorism. And I'm also pleased that I was not discouraged, for example, by Wesleyan when I taught there. And I received, for example, early on a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities. I felt that people thought that the study of terrorism was something that was legitimate for a scholar to do, although it was always a controversial sort of thing. And I began my work working on the causes of terrorism. And I think that article that was published in 1981, The Causes of Terrorism, which was more of a conceptual framework with illustrations and examples of what I meant rather than a large empirical study. I did try to lay out what might be considered the causes of terrorism, and I think that article has stood the test of time. And then I think the next contribution that I made in terms of understanding terrorism had more to do with the process of violence itself, and it had to do with the development of organizational theories on terrorism. And again, these were embryonic, they were rudimentary, but they at least were an idea that I put out there that I think had some traction. And I contrasted organizational theories of terrorism to strategic theories of terrorism. And I think we're still arguing about that. So it's a debate that's ongoing. And that, excuse me, I've turned my attention to how terrorism comes to an end. And again, at that time, I don't think very many other people were thinking about this as a subject. So in the 1990s, I published a couple of articles on that subject, just trying to think about it. And most of these were simply my trying to think it through. How would we approach this? What would be a conceptual framework for analyzing this? And I enough empirical work to provide some examples that made it plausible that this would be a way of looking at it, but by no means conclusive. And so I'm pleased that other people have picked this up and have done major studies where they've accumulated a lot of data. But I will say that one of the things that was a great asset to me in the early years was a grant I got from the National Endowment for the Humanities, which was 78, 79?
Very early on.
78, it was early on. And in effect, they gave me a grant simply to read about terrorism.
Which happens rarely, though.
It's rare.
It's
very rare that you get that, or you just learn about your subject. And I spent a year learning about all the cases of terrorism that I could find, and that stood me in enormously good stead over the years.
Your early work was on Algeria. Your
Yes.
very, very early work.
Yes, my PhD dissertation was on the use of terrorism by the FLE during the Algerian War, and I subsequently published that. And with some difficulty because there was not that much interest in terrorism at that period of time, but the Hoover Institution at Stanford, of all things, wound up publishing it. Yeah, it's really a short monograph, but it was reasonably solid, and it made a strategic argument about terrorism, that the FLE had strategic uses for terrorism, that it was essentially instrumental in the service of a national liberation struggle. That was controversial at the time. A lot of people accused me of trying to justify terrorism, which I wasn't trying to do. I was simply pointing out that it could be regarded as an instrumental use of violence for a political purpose.
And those arguments were later drawn out in the causes of terrorism piece, giving greater nuance and more dimensions to it.
Probably more, somewhat in the causes of terrorism, and then later on work I did, for example, a chapter on the strategic logic of terrorism. So I did both of those angles, and I also did work on the psychology of terrorism. So that may seem contradictory, but I tried to look at different lenses through which one could see terrorism, and then try to think of ways that one could pull all these together to make it into a more comprehensive explanation. I'm not sure I've succeeded at that, but at least identify the components of an explanation.
So, and what led you to actually begin studying terrorism? In many respects, terrorism was quite common at this period of time. There were terror attacks going on, but there wasn't a lot of research on terrorism as such. So what drew you as a scholar to the study of terrorism?
Well, actually at that time, there was not a lot of terrorism. There was some, but interestingly enough, we didn't really begin talking about terrorism as a subject until about 1972, after the attack on the Munich Olympics. Before then, if you looked in an index, so you looked in the index to the Reader's Guide to Periodical Literature, you wouldn't find terrorism. You'd find assassination, kidnapping, hijacking. It's only later that terrorism becomes a something out there. But I became interested in this, I think two things. One, when I was an undergraduate, I took courses in Russian history, and the terrorist organizations at that time were very dramatic organizations, so I knew something about their history. And then I have to say that I was in graduate school, and I was taking a seminar, and I needed a topic for my paper. And we were reading a book called Guerrilla Warfare in the 1960s, because it was the late 1960s. At the end of the book, it said, nobody's ever studied terrorism. So I thought, that would make a good paper topic. And I couldn't, and since there was no literature on the subject to speak of, I couldn't think of anything to do but a case study of an instance that I knew about that happened to be Algeria, because I spent my junior year abroad in Paris. And I knew something about the Algerian War. So I did a case study. And but I couldn't do something that demonstrated somebody else's theory, because there really wasn't a theory. So I just had to kind of sort of just do the best I could.
Develop a kind of conceptual framework.
Right.
That's interesting. and so looking back at the evolution of the field over the course of your career, what do you think should have received more attention? And are there any things that you think should have perhaps received less attention?
Mm-hmm. Well, we were slow to begin thinking about how, the ending of terrorism. And I think we were often in the development of the study of terrorism very event-driven and very policy-driven. And that's sort of inevitable because, again, what we think of as sort of the modern period of terrorism does begin in the late 1960s, but it mounts up slowly. And but it was always a salient policy issue. So we were often very much driven by what policymakers were interested in. So there tended to be, for example, in the 1980s, a debate over whether or not most terrorism was actually sponsored by the Soviet Union. So a lot of the study of terrorism is highly politicized. And also it suffered from not being very well integrated into the study of conflict and political violence as a whole. It also tended to suffer from not being integrated into the study of foreign policy, because it was a foreign policy issue. So it tended not to be studied as one issue among others, or studied as one example of political violence among others. And I have to say I wrote an article on this, I think in the early 1990s. It certainly didn't convince everybody to start seeing terrorism as simply one form of political violence. So I think that's something that we should have seen as a field earlier and considered that there's a spectrum, and terrorism is somewhere along the spectrum. And also, I think often people were tempted to speak of and to study terrorist organizations as though you would have an entity or actor that did nothing but acts of terrorism, when most of these groups that we're interested in, conspiratorial undergrounds as they are, do a lot of different things, and they're essentially political actors, and often they participate in politics as well. So we came to these recognitions as we moved through the field, but they came later on. And particularly during the Cold War, I think there's this tendency to see terrorism in the context of the Cold War. That may be why we've seen probably more theoretical developments in before. And also remember when the study of terrorism began, we didn't even have computers, never mind large databases of terrorism incidents and this and that. So all that has led to a real shift in the way people study terrorism. We now have a whole lot more data than we did before, and obviously the news and analyzing the data that we simply lack.
Is it your sense that perhaps one of the reasons why there was this assumption early on that terrorist groups only commit terrorism is because there were very few cases of terrorist organizations that would be studied in any depth? And they tended to be like that, or was it just a greater blind spot brought on by the policy community? Or
oh well, yeah, it's kind of hard for me to think why that would be the case. And probably it was politically driven. Because remember, it's fairly late that we began to develop the notion of identifying foreign terrorist organizations, and they're in effect subjected to sanctions in many cases, sort of speaking times. And also, I think that perhaps just simply a way of isolating field from others, not deliberately, but kind of trying to identify the unit of analysis in that way, or maybe just not thinking it through very clearly. Because remember, the study of terrorism has always been very interdisciplinary. The study of political violence has been more, I think, political science as a discipline, whereas the people who are interested in terrorism who come from anywhere and everywhere, like psychologists, psychiatrists, policymakers, political scientists, anthropologists, sociologists, historians, all mixed in together. So that, at least if you talked about terrorist organizations, it was kind of a unifying concept for all of that. But it also meant that everybody was bringing a different kind of epistemology, if you will, to the study of terrorism. And so it's been very difficult to get everybody focused.
There's a learning curve, I imagine.
Oh,
I mean, you really just have to learn vocabularies of other disciplines to be able to talk.
You did.
The colleagues in the same subject area.
Those conferences on terrorism would have had a really eclectic group of people.
Are there any things then along these lines that you feel should have received less attention throughout the history of the study of terrorism? In other words, a classic example of debates over the definition, right? So the definitional debates on terrorism, much like on genocide, the scholarly analysis of genocide, there are these, at least in the study of genocide, sometimes seemingly terminal debates about what genocide is, so that the second step can be taken where you actually analyze large-scale violence. Are there things like, or even the definitional question on terrorism, what are your thoughts on this?
Oh, well, the debates over defining terrorism, they started at the beginning and they go on now. It goes on forever. I wrote an article defining terrorism that was published in 1972. And I still pretty much stick by my definition, but it's almost always the case that when I give a talk on terrorism, I always get a question, but don't you know that one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter? Like, oh, what a profound observation. No, never crossed my mind. That, of course, is a very subjective interpretation. So terrorism has always had a pejorative sort of connotation to it. And sort of unavoidable. On the other hand, I've never thought that we could do away with the use of the term because you can't move your own academic terminology so far from common language use of the term. So it's like genocide. You're going to use that term no matter what. You can't define it in a way that's so different from what people just understand it to mean. And so with terrorism, we've had innumerable definitional debates and a tendency on the part of some scholars and often policymakers to wish to use it as a label. Use it as a way of labeling the opponent. So whatever the opponent does is terrorism, whatever you do is not terrorism. So those sorts of normative debates have always entered into it, and I don't think we'll ever get away from it. I still hear them out there. Now, I try to define terrorism as a certain method of violence that groups use, and I'm interested in the use of that form of violence by conspiratorial underground groups with ideas for radical political change, revolutionary movements, immigration movements, groups that are anti-state fundamentally. And other people can define it differently if they want to, and I'll stick with my definition, and that's what I go with. And I'm always at pains to describe that, which is why I like to get away from the term terrorist organizations. It's hard not to use it. I've used it myself, but it's a shorthand, but I try to get away from that because I understand that there's the actor and then there's the method. And not all actors in the light might choose terrorism as a method. And there's much greater recognition of that now in the field. I think that's pretty well accepted.
Yeah, it seems like the field is growing enormously, and it's also become theoretically more sophisticated, reflexive.
Oh, it has. Yes, definitely. And that's been a very good step forward. And most of that's post-9/11.
Well, and along these lines, what do you think are some of the issues and questions that still remain to be addressed at the forefront of the study of terrorism today?
Well, interestingly enough, one of the issues that is now being taken up, and I think in a very useful way, has to do with, I think, what we might call sort of processes of terrorism, not just the causes, the effects. But this is something that I've become interested in recently, and happily discovered that other people doing other forms of civil conflict are also interested in. And this is the relationship among the actors who are violent actors. So the way I have come to describe this is, I call it mapping militants. But what I'm talking about is, in any given conflict theater, conflict system, the opponents of the state or autonomous actors who see themselves as supporting those in the state or not under the control of the state, how do they relate to each other and to the state? And what I came to understand and to observe was that it's not just this binary relationship, the state, the opponent, which many mathematical models will show you this is what it is. One on one side, one on the other is conflict dyad. There's rarely a conflict where there are not multiple actors out there, underground actors, and they're shifting relationships with each other that change over time. Sometimes they come together, sometimes they split apart. So how do we understand those relationships? And how do we understand, first of all, just the patterns of relationships among these groups that are highly complex. Second, what are the causes of different patterns of relationships? And third, of course, what are their consequences? And those consequences could be for a number of things, like levels of violence. There's a common assumption that the greater the number of violent oppositional actors in this kind of system or orbit, violence goes up with the number of actors because they compete with each other. There's outwarding extremism, phenomena like that. But we've not really demonstrated that very conclusively, and we've tended to sometimes to neglect the fact that they cooperate with each other. So all of these are things that are going to be explored, and it turns out that students of Civil War particularly have become interested in this as well. So now we can kind of, in a way, merge the study of terrorism into the broader field of the study of political violence. But I will say that there remains a gap because, as you know, when you study Civil War, often you study the 1,000 battle deaths a year conflict, which is a major conflict. And then the next step down would be 25 battle deaths a year, which gets you into a much smaller range of conflicts. But these are still civil wars. So I'm not sure whether that would then include, say, Pakistan, contemporary Pakistan, unless it were in Baluchistan, where you might consider that civil war. I'm not sure you would or not. Or contemporary Bangladesh. So conflicts that kind of fall below that threshold, and where terrorism often predominates. For a reason, we haven't studied it to find out why. So I'm very interested in studying levels of conflict that might not reach up to this higher level. But I can understand that we might be seeing many of the same processes, and it's very important for all of us to talk to each other. So that's sort of, and let me say, we also both run the same problem, which is the data are not really good. Whenever you study spiritual violence, it's not going to be easy to get information on. But maybe it's worth the trouble to try to come up with that. And of course, as you know, my work has never been very statistical. It's tended to be more historical and conceptual. But I'm happy with that. I'm not going to learn statistics now.
But you've done some formal work with things with Larski and others.
I have worked with other people who had those sorts of skills, and I could certainly help interpret what we found and talk through it with them. But yes, Manny Midlarski and I were at Ethel Sorensen's presidential address last night, sitting next to each other, and her address was on the subject of diffusion. And after the address, I turned to him and I said, we published an article on that, and I think, was it 80 or 81?
Certainly did.
We did. And then later, I've done work with Gary Lafree and other colleagues at the Stark Center of Maryland, and they provided the statistical insight. and I've done some of the other part of it. So I have no problem with cooperating, but I really don't have those skills myself. So
We certainly have a long history of cooperating with other scholars, with embedded volumes and cooperating.
Oh, I've always found that very stimulating thing to do. I enjoy working with others.
And so it seems then from what you're saying, one of the crucial questions for the future of terrorism studies is, in fact, integrating it into the broader study of political violence. You mentioned civil war. I imagine also some of the study of counterinsurgency.
Definitely, because I myself think that the distinction between counterinsurgency and counterterrorism is not entirely clear. Because you might say, well, okay, insurgents need and want popular support, terrorists do not need and want popular support. But that's really not strictly true at all. And what we call insurgents could use terrorism. Terrorism occurs within the context of civil wars by actors who are fighting for control of the state. We would think that it would not occur in that context. So I think maybe one of our jobs ought to be to talk about insurgency and other forms of violence that have what would we say, a larger mobilization threshold. Many more people are involved, more people are killed, conflict is more wide spread, it's more expensive. And to integrate those levels with lower levels where maybe there's only terrorism is employed in the conflict. But it's still important to understand that when does terrorism then escalate? We don't really, I don't think we really quite know that. We don't really know the trajectories of these sorts of conflicts. And if we look at the bigger picture, we might get that. And who would say that terrorism is not important in Afghanistan? Or look at Iraq and say that's a civil conflict, but terrorism is very important. And I would certainly throw into that category the attacks on Shia and buildings and clinics and mosques. Definitely that's terrorism. It's had a major impact on Iraq. But we just say, oh, that's an insurgency, so that's now
racket.
Yeah, racket. Yes, exactly. So that's insurgency. I'm going to study terrorism over here. You don't understand what's going on. So, and sometimes scholars are not comfortable with that because it's so messy. And it really is messy, and it's a struggle to try to understand it. And your data don't fit neatly there. They're just going to show you one slice. So you got to bring in the other pieces. And it's not easy. It's not always satisfying if you're very logical to deal with something that's so messy.
Well, you've also written for a long period of time now about the importance of studying de-escalation of terrorism, right? And it seems that along these lines, it's difficult to actually be able to provide some systematic insights over de-escalation if terrorist violence isn't properly situated with the broader study.
Exactly. You can't see what's going on unless you see the context, which is why I edited a book called Terrorism in Context. But another thing I've been concerned to do that I also think is very important is to look at the conflict and look at the use of violence from the perspective of a non-state actor, not always from the perspective of the state, but to try to understand how they make decisions, how they choose their targets, how they choose their strategies. And this, again, is not easy. The data are very limited. They're very incomplete. We struggle to understand why these actors act as they do from their own point of view. So you're not trying to impose a causal mechanism that has to do with environmental conditions, obviously poverty, whatever, land holding records, etc., but how they perceive their circumstances. And you can get at it, but it's very hard to get at it. You're not going to find it in a large database. It will take a lot of digging. And even then, you may be misled. There are all sorts of reasons that people don't tell you. You never perfectly know anybody's motive, but I still think it's worth trying to see the world as they see it if we can, no matter how abhorrent the world even at each of us. Still, how are they looking at things and why are they using violence as they do?
This is the old Liberian insight about sensitivity to self-understanding as the first step, though it also includes a broader framework.
Yeah, precisely. How can you figure out why they're doing what they're doing or what they're going to do without seeing how they see the world? How could you understand the impact of what you do, so we stay or be the outside actor, if we don't understand how they're going to perceive what we're doing? And it's worth the struggle to try to understand that, even if the understanding is not. It is a sort of reflexivity.
Yeah. And this is actually related to another question. In your work for early period of your work and the work of other scholars who work on terrorism, there was some attention from policymakers, and so it was very policy oriented. But there was also concern that you've raised for a long period of time, which was sometimes the way questions were framed or the types of information that they wanted was very constrained and very limited kind of focus. Is it your sense that policymakers and others in governments are more sensitive to the complexity of terrorism today? In other words, has the scholarship really made an impact on how policymakers themselves understand terrorism? Or is this still a significant challenge?
Well, all I can say is it varies a lot. There are policymakers who are, many have academic backgrounds themselves, who are very sensitive to the complexities and nuances, the very murkiness of what we're dealing with, the uncertainty. Others are more fixed in their orientation. And there is a tendency on the part of the policy community to, let's say, adopt trends. So, for example, there's certain trends that this is what they want to study, this is what they want to fund research on, this is what they see the heart of the field being. So, for many years, the interest is in WMD terrorism, weapons of mass destruction. And sort of an unfortunate acronym, but there we are. Other people have redefined it and said the weapons of mass consequence would be a better term, whatever we're stuck with the term. And particularly nuclear, but also the use of chemical and biological weapons. So they they saw this as a grave danger, a grave threat. President Obama has said that the use of nuclear weapons by terrorists is one of the top national security threats. So that's an assumption that this is the top. I'm not sure I'd agree with it.
Therefore, it attracts a lot of attention.
Yes, much attention now to this, and this has been true actually for many years. But it actually picked up sort of speed under the Clinton administration, so it's been with us for a long time. It's not just the current administration. And another issue that also kind of was a bandwagon type issue is radicalization, which has become sort of in many ways the latest buzzword. What are we afraid of? Oh, it's radicalization. And I actually have a student now at Stanford who's writing a senior thesis on how this came onto the policy agenda. And he argues that you look at 911, and you look at even at pre-911, I don't know if you've heard of the case called the Lackawanna 6.
Yes.
Right, these were young men who presumably became interested in jihad before 9/11. So, but you don't hear anybody talking about, homegrown terrorism, danger of radicalization of your citizens. And apparently we begin this discussion in the U.S. after the London bombings, when Tony Blair talked about, and this is the first major instance that caught people's attention. There was the citizens of your own state who apparently were radicalized by an ideology that was sort of external to the domestic policy today. It's not like the far right. And then a willing to use violence against their own fellow citizens and govern. So this is when it begins to come onto the policy agenda in the United States and becomes an issue. Before then, it's just not something anybody talked about or studied or anything. And then now, everybody has to study radicalization, even though we don't have a common definition of what it is. And then we have to have, of course, counter-radicalization, which is radicalization. And of course, counter-radicalization has become very controversial. The FBI, the New York Police Department, surveillance, various misguided assumptions about the nature of Islam.
The FBI famously has been in the news for this.
Yes, by hiring some completely unqualified instructors to teach their agents about Islam. It's really been very unfortunate. But that's sort of been this driving force. If there's funding for studying something, studying radicalization, that trend may be passing out of our.
You've also written a bit recently on the distinction between new and old forms of terrorist organizations, which seems like also something that's received a lot of attention.
That's relevant to that today. Well, often my scholarly interests are prompted by annoyance at what other people have said. So, for example, people begin to talk about a new terrorism, totally different from the past, and homegrown and radicalization that often features part of this new terrorism. And they argued that that terrorism kind of, hard to say exactly when this began, but most of it would be religious terrorism, and often the subtext was Islamic terrorism. This is totally new, totally different. Whatever we knew about the past was useless, harmful. So I was very annoyed by that statement because I, having studied terrorism beginning, and really with the French Revolution, seemed to be this bigger continuity. So I felt compelled to combat those arguments. I think now the anti-new terrorism proponents will win the debate. There's been a lot of writing, so I think that the anti-new are coming out ahead, and some of the new terrorism proponents are backtracking. But I will say, in that respect, that one puzzling aspect of terrorism that a lot of people study, but we've not gotten at all to the bottom of, is the use of suicide missions as a terrorist tactic, and the transnational diffusion of this tactic. And people are trying to understand that, but we certainly don't fully understand how this happened, whether this is a very particular historical circumstance that we're seeing now, how this tactic was spread the way it did, Lebanon, Palestine, Iraq, and then Afghanistan, Pakistan, Bangladesh to a certain extent. Or are there general patterns that we need to be discerning here in order to know where it might happen in other ways? So that's an aspect of terrorism that people are working on.
So that's one of the next
It's a challenge.
Yeah.
It's a challenge.
So I wanted to take a step back for a moment. If you had done an interview like this when you were mid-career, who would you have liked to have interviewed? Who were some of the
Well, I have to think back
lights
to when it was. I have to think back to when that would have been. So maybe we would say mid-1980s, perhaps. I've been doing this for a long time, obviously. I often joke. I say I'd like to say that I published my first article while I was in kindergarten, but I have to admit I was in graduate school. Well, let me just say that there were at least three or four other people who were with, in at the beginning, and that would be the late Paul Wilkinson, who was really one of the early writers who wrote early on that relationship between terrorism and democracy. David Rappaport, who is here at ISA, actually, who wrote a classic early study distinguishing assassination from terrorism, and continued to work in the field and he was very instrumental. And Ara Murari, an Israeli psychologist, who also is still working in the field, recently published a book on suicide terrorism based on interviews in Israeli jails. And then on the policy think tank side, Brian Jenkins of the Rand Corporation, who was very instrumental in, expressing a very sober and sound policy judgment. And there were a lot of people who much more, who had a tendency sometimes to exaggerate, and Brian was always a voice of reason. And then more people began to enter the field, sort of a next generation. So I would say, and I tell you, I cannot totally remember when people began to enter the field, but Louise Richardson, who started at Harvard, Jessica Stern, Audrey Cronin, were people who entered the field sort of in midstream, and Brian Hoffman at the Rand Corporation, who now teaches at Georgetown, Dan Lyman, who teaches at Georgetown, and then also someone who early on was an analyst with a statistical approach because he was an economist, Todd Sandler, who's now at the University of North Texas. And Todd did some of the early and really, really good work using statistical approaches and continues to work on terrorism. Leonard Weinberg is another figure in development of terrorism. He did some classic work on the relationship between groups that use terrorism and political parties. Among a younger generation, there's Amit Benzur, who teaches at the University of Texas, who's done also wrote with Leonard Weinberg on political parties. And that's an important insight that people now are recognizing that this early work was important, that you can have an actor that switches between legitimate legal needs and political needs. Who's the same actor? You can't filter that out. The people associated with the Combating Terrorism Center at West Point, who sort of occupies the roles between academia and kind of an internal policy think tank. Criminologists are now into the field. Gary Leffery are at Maryland and the START Center. Among psychologists and the younger generation, John Horgan is now at Penn State as a center on radicalization. A number of people now in Europe. There's Peter Norman, who's at King's, who has done a lot of work on strategies of terrorism. At the same center, Mike Smith. So a number of people in France, Didier Bigot, someone who's written extensively on terrorism, also Michel Dubourca. In Spain, Fernando Linares, Rafael Alonso.
You ran a coordinator program with them.
I've worked a lot with many of these scholars. I've worked extensively with them. So it's a real international network. Rohan Gunaratna, who's in Singapore. Magnus Ransdorf in Sweden. I've worked with the Danish Institute of International Studies on issues of terrorism. Various institutes in Spain. In fact, I was in Barcelona a little under a year ago, last May, I think, for a conference at the Eagle, your research center, Eagle. I can't remember what it's called. So there are a number of people now around the world who work on these issues. I mean, I could go on forever naming.
It's truly an international network.
It's truly
very different from
international.
what it is.
Well, you know, it's actually always reasonably international. Yeah, it was always international. So one of the early people writing about terrorism was Rona Calabro. Of course, it's now Hillary at the European University Institute. Her students continue to study terrorism, some of them are here at ISA. So it's really a far-flung network of just several generations of people who study terrorism over the years. So I can't say that any of my